So this week is week 3. All right, so we've only got what? We're 49 weeks left, right? We're moving along, right? In the 52 weeks. So we've started week 3, and in week 3, we've gone from creation to the flood, and then we went from the flood through to Abraham and Isaac. I mean, we covered a massive amount of time period in just 2 weeks. And the other thing that's kind of interesting with, like now, if you kind of think back for the last week, we had a pretty good bit of information that God gives us about Abraham. We had practically very little about Isaac. I mean, very little about Isaac. And then we get to Jacob, okay? And so then we get to the end of this week, we're already going from Jacob, and we're starting to talk about Joseph kicking into the picture here. But with today, what I want to do is I'll kind of give a run at some of the highlights that go through this section that we're reading, and then I'll camp out kind of here at the end at Genesis chapter 35. But Genesis, the end of chapter 29 and the beginning of chapter 30 tells us some interesting things about Jacob and his family. If you remember how Jacob ends up with his family, remember he had tricked his father to steal the blessing from Esau. And then because Esau is going to kill him, Mama then devises a plan and tells Dad, we need to send him back to my father's house, send him back to where I came from, and he needs to go back there and he needs to find him a wife. So he takes off and he heads on back. Now, in the process, and we'll come back here at the end and talk about this a little bit more, but in the process, that first night when he leaves, he ends up sleeping at a little place called Luz that's renamed Bethel, and that's where he sees a vision. And then he moves on from there, and he ends up going, and he comes back to the town of Haran, where his mother's from. And he's there, and he sees a pretty girl coming, and he falls in love, and he's going to have her. So come to find out, she is his mother's daughter. Okay, she's in the family. It's Laban's daughter. And so she takes and he makes a deal with Laban for Rachel. And he says, I'll work 7 years for her. Right? And so he works 7 years because he loves her. And he says it just kind of like takes like this. And then he's deceived. And honestly, I don't get it. I really don't. You know, all I can tell you is they didn't have electricity. The tent's dark. Daddy told her to be quiet. Put a veil over her face and don't say anything till morning. So he goes in, and Laban's done what? Given the other sister, giving him Leah. Okay? And, of course, the next morning he wakes up and there's this... I'm sure the terror and shock's probably even lacking what the real expression would have been on Jacob's face. But then makes a deal with Laban. Go ahead and give you Rachel too, and then you're going to work for me another 7 years. So he does. And Rachel's the one that he loves. Okay? Now here's the thing. Leah's the one that's his first wife. Okay? Y'all remember going back to the garden? God created the man, and then he created the woman, and he did what? He brings the two together. And then Moses makes a statement and says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined with his wife, and two will become one flesh. And God does everything through that marital union. So when it's one, he's meaning the one flesh, the husband and wife. And so that's the same thing that happened when we talked about Abraham. You know, Abraham's going to have a son, but it's not going to be with him and somebody else. It's going to be him and his wife, Sarah. Okay, his first wife, his true wife. Now, you get to this point, and Jacob's been tricked. Okay? But look, here's the one thing that we know about God. God's got a sovereign plan. And he'll use even the schemes and the deception of man for his purposes. Okay? So I just kind of think that Jacob, unlike when the servant for Abraham goes to Haran to find a wife for Isaac, he goes and he prays and says, Lord, show me the one. And then boom, here's Rebekah coming. Jacob don't go and do that. When he gets there, he just looks and sees there's the pretty girl and I like her. Okay, anybody ever had the lust of the eyes get you in trouble? Okay, so Jacob he loves Rachel. He just got stuck with Leah. Here's the deal. God knew the plan. And if you look at the end of chapter 29 through the first of chapter 30, I want to run down this for a second. Chapter 29, verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb. She wasn't just not liked, she wasn't loved. Okay? But Rachel was unable to conceive. So who's able to conceive? The first wife, the real wife, the one that was, look, I get it, he was deceived, but she's his first wife. Okay? And so she's able to conceive. Verse 32 says, Leah conceived, gave birth to a son, named him Reuben. For she said, the Lord has seen my affliction. Surely my husband will love me now. Here's the thing, as we'll see in a minute, we'll get a little farther into this. Because Jacob loves Rachel, I would make the argument when we get a little farther in this passage that Jacob lives in the tent with Rachel. Leah got her own tent over here. She gets a visit every now and then. But the household, as far as where Jacob's living, is in there with Rachel. Okay? So Leah's finally going, hey, look, I conceived. Now my husband's got to love me, right? Because, look, like it or not, back in that day, most of the woman's value was decided on whether she could produce sons. And so I've got a son. Surely my husband's going to love me now. Okay, and then verse 33, she conceived again, gave birth to a son. The Lord heard that I am unloved and has given me this son also. She named him Simeon. Then she conceived again, gave birth to a son. At last my husband will become attached to me because I bore 3 sons to him. Therefore she named him Levi. Again, this is still what? Husband's over here with Rachel, the one he loves. She's kind of stuck over here. Okay? And then verse 35, she conceives again, gives birth to a son. Said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Judah. Then Leah stopped having children. First wife, real wife. First 4 sons, of which 2, Levi and Judah, come out of this. Okay? Now, chapter 30 then starts when Rachel saw she had was not bearing Jacob any children, she envied her sister. Look, I can't think of anything harder. It's hard enough marriage. But to have more than one wife and it to be a sibling rivalry, that's a tough deal. Okay? Now you know why, honestly, instead of having one house for Leah and him and Rachel and another, it might have been justification to have a third house, one for just Jacob. Okay? Peace in the house is going to be kind of hard. Why? Because if the women can't get along and those arguments going, and it's made worse by the fact that they're sisters. Okay? She envies her sister. Look, she's the one that he loves. She's the one that's got him living with her. But she's still what? She's still envious of the fact that what? She's having kids and I'm not. And sons on top of that. So she's envious of her sister. And so she basically gets mad at Jacob. Give me sons or I'll die, she said to Jacob. Jacob became angry with Rachel. All right, look, even in the best household, you can still have a fight, right? Gets angry with Rachel and says, am I in the place of God who has withheld offspring from you? Who's the one that's in control of the womb? God. Okay. Verse 3, then she said, here is my maid Bilhah. Go sleep with her, and she'll bear children for me, so that through her I can build a family. She's got Jacob living in the house with her. It's not enough. She's wanting to build what? A family. And look, the sibling rivalry and the jealousy is so strong that she's willing to what? Add another layer of difficulty by, hey, here's my servant, go sleep with her. And the stupid man goes, okay. Hey? So now he's got what? He's picked up a third wife. So, verse 4, so Rachel gave her slave Bilhah to Jacob as a wife, and he slept with her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Rachel said, God has vindicated me. Look, all this is because of what? She don't like it. She's angry at her sister. She feels like that having a baby from her own slave that's vindication. Because she's what? She ain't happy about this whole situation. And look, you kind of have to agree with her somewhat, don't you? I mean, she was the one who was supposed to marry Jacob, right? And she kind of got, look, I'm sure she wasn't a willing participant in it, but Leah had to have been. When Daddy said what? Hey, look, it ain't supposed to be you, but you go in there and don't say a word, just be quiet. Okay, she had to have been a willing participant in that. So you can kind of see that's got the tension in the house really high. So she sees that even with her own servant producing a son for her as vindication. And then she says, yes, he has heard me, has given me a son. So she named him Dan. Rachel's slave Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Jacob said, in my wrestlings with God, I have wrestled with my sister and won. I've added another layer. I've given my own servant. I've added a third woman to the mix. But she so sees the sibling rivalry so hard that she sees this as a win for her. Okay? She named him Naphtali. Verse 9, when Leah saw that she had stopped having children, and it worked for the other one, she took her slave Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. And again, the dumb man goes, okay. Yeah. So let's add a fourth layer to this thing. So Leah's slave Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, what good fortune, and she named him Gad. You got to think she's probably sitting over there going, my sister, she didn't like all this, she did all this, and look, God just gave me another one. Okay, she named him Gad. Then Leah's slave Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Leah said, I'm happy, and the woman called me happy. She named him Asher. And then it stops there for a minute and it goes to this. It says, Reuben went out during the wheat harvest. Reuben, he's the firstborn of all of the sons. Okay. He goes out during the wheat harvest, found some mandrakes in the field. When he brought them to his mother Leah, Rachel asked, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. I think it was a simple question. It's going to turn into a negotiation. But Leah replied to her, isn't it enough that you've taken my husband? So there's some strife going on. And we're well up in years now of this going on. Okay? And so what did she say? Is it not enough that you've taken my husband? This is the reason why I think, because of this passage here, Jacob's living over there in the tent with Rachel. Okay? You've taken my husband. And then she says, well, then Rachel says, then Rachel said, he can sleep with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. I'll let him come out and come over there and visit you tonight if you'll give me some of those. Poor Jacob, he's too dumb to realize at this point he's the negotiation tool here. You know. When Jacob came in from the field that evening, Leah went to meet him and said, you must come with me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrake. So Jacob slept with her that night. Rachel has loaned him out. And but Leah saw it as what? He's my husband, and she's right. Okay. Then God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore a fifth son. Okay. and she names him Issachar. Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. God has given me a good gift. This time my husband will honor me because I have bore him 6 sons. And she named him Zebulun. And then later she bore him a daughter named Dinah. And then after the first wife is completely done, then God says, God remembered Rachel. Not until after Leah's done. He listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son. She said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph. And then she said, may the Lord add another son to me. And he will, but it'll be on the day of her death when she gives birth to Benjamin. Okay. But through all of this, you kind of see there's this sibling rivalry going and all these things are going. Now, part of the reason why this is important is because, remember, God's got a plan and it's through Jacob and it's through his one wife, his true wife. Because God's going to take, with Abraham, it wasn't Abraham and Hagar, it was Abraham and his wife Sarah, and then it was Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and then it's got to be Jacob and what? One of his wives, and he's picked up 4 now. Okay? But which one is it? Well, it's Leah. It's not just that she's his first wife, but God verifies that in the fact that she's got the one, through their union is all the promises of God. Levi, her third-born son. That's the priestly line. Judah. Oh, that's the really important one because that's not only the kingly line, that's the line of David, that's the line of the Messiah comes through. So every bit of the promises that come to Jacob come through him and Leah. And then I sometimes talk about the fact that if you go and you look at the cave, you look where they're buried. The patriarchs of the faith are buried in a cave. Abraham buys a cave when Sarah dies, and he buries Sarah there. And then when Abraham dies, he's buried beside his wife. And then when Isaac and Rebekah die, guess where they're put? In the same cave together, the two of them. So the patriarchs are in the cave. And then there's the third layer of it, and that's Jacob. And who's in the cave in the tomb with Jacob? It's not Rachel. When she dies, giving birth on the way back to the promised land, she's buried along the way. Who's in the tomb? It's Leah. The patriarchs of the faith are all buried together. They're also, the promises of God are coming. It wasn't even scattered. It's all through Leah, okay, with his union with Leah. Now, as we look through this, it goes on, the chapter 30, some time has passed into chapter 30 and the beginning of chapter 31. What we have here is Jacob's ready to kind of get on. He's got a family. Look, he's got 4 wives and got a whole passel of kids, and he needs to be able to support them. But he's been over there in Laban's household, and so he's ready to leave. But Laban decides he doesn't want him to leave. Why? Because God's blessing Jacob, Laban's getting wealthy. So he devises a plan. And so he keeps changing the wages for Jacob. And so basically, but God behind the scenes is dealing with that. And so Jacob's going to end up with the one with all the possessions. Okay? Now, when he gets ready to leave, he leaves in a hurry, and he don't tell him he's leaving. Okay? And at chapter 31, verse 24, well, Laban's running Jacob down. Jacob got a 3-day start. Okay? Laban runs him down. Laban catches up. And right before that, the night before he catches up with him, verse 24, chapter 31 of Genesis, verse 24. But God came to Laban, the Aramean, in a dream at night and said, watch yourself. God warned him. Don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Look, don't go up and try to sucker him and, you know what, I love you, I miss you, come on back, I'll give you half of everything. Nothing good? Don't do nothing bad either. Don't curse him, nothing. It's a warning from God. Okay. Now so when he does catch up, he's got to watch his tongue. God's already told him. The end of verse 30, here's what Laban's biggest complaint is at this point, since he can't say nothing about the rest of it. But why have you stolen my gods? Why have you stolen my gods? Remember those household gods that we came up with about it with Abraham? Why have you stolen my gods? Look, let's be honest. How much faith would you have in a God that you got to worry about him getting stolen and can't take care of himself? Okay? But here you are. Why are you taking my gods? Now, what he didn't know, Jacob didn't know, was his loved wife, Rachel, had actually stolen them. Okay? But they move on, and they make a covenant between them. Okay? And Laban goes his way, and Jacob goes on his way. Okay? And then chapter 32 and 33, Jacob is getting ready to meet Esau. Remember last time he was dealing with Esau was 20 years before this, and Esau was like, you know what, after we mourn Daddy's death, I'm going to kill him. Oh, by the way, it's been 20 years, Daddy still ain't died yet. Okay? Daddy just thought he was going to die. That's why he did the blessing that night. He thought he was getting ready to die. Okay? 20 years have passed. Now, the end of chapter 32 is Jacob wrestling with God, okay, that night, all night long. And this passage, I think sometimes we overanalyze one section of it and we miss parts of it, okay? But as he finishes wrestling with him that night, right? God, this is the pre-incarnate Christ, I believe, is wrestling with him. God says to him, "What's your name?" And he says, "Jacob." Verse 28, "Your name will no longer be Jacob," he said. "It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." Look, Jacob, he's a fighter. He's been a fighter for such a mama's boy. Remember back when he was with mama? For such a mama's boy, he's a fighter when it comes to when he knows what he's want to mess with and what he wants. He's a fighter. Okay. And then Jacob asked him what his name was, and God doesn't tell him. But God had done what? God said, "I'm changing your name to Israel." Okay? Because you struggle with God. And then verse 30, it says, Jacob named that place Peniel, "For I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." Okay. He wrestles with God. Okay. He's on his way back. What had taken place? When Laban and him had gotten so far sideways on everything, God came to him and said, "It's now time for you to leave and go back to your family. Go back to your father's family." Okay? And so on the way back, he knows he's got to run into who? His brother Esau somewhere along the way. Okay? And he's going to pull out all the stops to try to get Esau to accept him and not kill him, basically. Okay? But on the way, he meets up with God here this night, right? And after all that, the next morning, he goes back across and when they come to Esau, he actually lines everybody up, and there's a new swagger to him. Instead of hiding in the back, he goes up front, and he's the one, keeps everybody else, and he meets Esau. Okay? Now, Esau's a changed man. 20 years, he ain't looking for him like he was back then. Okay? But God had, I guess in a way, God had restored a relationship. Okay? That Jacob had messed up. Okay? Now, before we go back a little bit, the next part of this is chapter 34. And you get here where Jacob's daughter Dinah, okay, they've moved from Haran, and they've gotten back into the promised land. They're back into the area. And they come to this Hivite town, and they are at, I believe it's Shechem. And so Dinah goes, and she's his daughter. And she goes into the town, and the guy, Shechem, who is the prince, rapes her. Okay? and then decides, you know what, I like her and I'd like to have her as my wife. Look, this story, it's brutal. Okay? Now look, from a father's perspective, I understand this story. Okay? I understand why too that this was wrong. Okay? But what do these boys do? Jacob's by himself for a while, so he has to kind of pull back, right? But as soon as the boys get there, and then, so he's got some people back in his camp, they have Shechem and his father come out, and they want to negotiate for what? For Dinah to become his wife. And you know what? Why don't you stay here with us? Be part of us. And honestly, the decision or the deception that they did, if you were in an all-out war, this is a brilliant move. You know what? We can't do this unless you what? You get circumcised like we are. Because who put that in place? God did with Abraham. And so they agree. We can intermarry, we can do it because we'll all be circumcised and we can do this. And they agree. And look, on the third day, look, when you have any kind of surgery, no matter what kind it is, the third day is usually when you're the sorest. Okay? On the third day after circumcising every man in the city, when they're all hurting too bad to fight, two of the brothers show up. And what? With the sword, and they wipe out all the men. They kill them all. Every one of them. Including the king and his son. Again, I think where this goes off track some, they didn't just deal with the one that was guilty. They killed all the men. They killed all. Now, look, from a military standpoint, this would have been genius. Get them where they can't fight. And again, as the father of girls, I understand this thing. Okay? But I also know that they took it too far. They murdered a lot of people that didn't have anything to do with this. Okay? Now, here's the funny thing. These people, the Hivites, they're the ones that got suckered in this deal. You know, and all the men got killed off of it. You know what? When after 400 years goes by and the Israelites come out of Egypt, and after they spend their additional 40 years wandering around in the wilderness, when Joshua brings them in, they were told, don't make any covenants. Don't make any deals with anybody in the land. They got suckered by one group real early on who's dressed up like they came from a long way off with their ratty clothes, the nastiest stuff, and tried and convinced them, we're not from the folks around here. We're from way off. And they made an agreement with them instead of killing them. You know who they were? These Hivites. So they may have deceived them back then. They get deceived by the same group later on, 450 years later. Okay. Now, after that, chapter 35 really puts us into the heart of where I want to roll today. Chapter 35, they are back in the land, okay, in the promised land. Chapter 35, verse 1, God said to Jacob, get up, go to Bethel, and settle there. Build an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. Now, for years, I know I rolled right on through this passage and didn't stop long enough to figure out. But this is a key event. That if we run through without paying attention, we'll go right on through this and miss the importance of what's taking place here. God came and told him to what? Get up and go to where? Bethel. Why is that important? Take your Bibles and turn back to Genesis chapter 28. Genesis chapter 28, and look at verse 20. That night when Jacob left his father's house to go toward Haran to go find a wife, that Jacob's ladder, the vision that he sees that we know is most of the time is Jacob's ladder, he sees that event. And then after that, look at verse 20. Then Jacob made a vow. Making a vow. to God. Okay? If God will be with me and watch over me during this journey I am making, if He provides me with food to eat, clothing to wear, and if I return safely to my Father's family, then the Lord will be my God. And the stone that I've set up as a marker will be God's house, and I will give you 1/10 of all that you've given me. But what did he say? This is the if-then statement of Jacob's life. If you will do all these things, if you will go with me, if you will be with me, if you will keep me safe, if you will bring me back to where? My Father's house, then I will make you what? My God. Jacob, back then when this all took place, Jacob's like most of us have been at one time or another. You kind of knew about God. You kind of said, okay, maybe you said, I believe in God. But there's not a saving moment there. Matter of fact, I know people, and maybe you do too, that have said, I believe in God. I even believe in Jesus. I got all that piece down. But I don't want I don't want to walk with Him right now. I want to come back after I've sowed my oats. I want to come back after I've lived my life. And somewhere down the road, I want to come back and I want to what? I'll follow you then. That saving moment. Look, Jacob's getting away with something that you and I can't necessarily do. He's getting to make a if-then thing with God. He's getting to have a, if you do this, then I will do that moment. Now, what's the difference? Well, they're called small little people group called out that God's using to what? Well, give us eventually this and give us the Messiah from. But He's making an if-then statement. God, if you will do all these things, then you'll be my God. Jacob's more from the secular standpoint. Yeah, I know about the God of my grandfather Abraham. I know about the God of Isaac, my father. Okay? And you know what? If you'll do all this for me, I'll make you my God. It's an if-then statement. 20 years have now gone by. Go back to chapter 35. 20 years have gone by, and what does God do? He comes to him and says, get up and go back to where? Bethel, which is where that night that took place. Okay? It's the geography, go back to the spot. But guess what? It's more than just the geography. It's the if-then. Okay? And Jacob's not going, I wonder why God's telling me to go back to Bethel. He knows exactly why he's being told to go back to Bethel. What does it say? He said, go there, build an altar to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau 20 years ago. So Jacob said to his family and all who are with him, get rid of the foreign gods that are among you. Here's how I know he knows what the deal is. He knows that he made a vow to God. It wasn't just a, hey, can you handle and take care of me? If you do these things, you'll be what? My God. So what do you need to do? Well, he's starting out by what? We got to clean up the house. Y'all go get the household gods. We're going to get rid of that. And then he says, get rid of the foreign gods that are among you. Purify yourselves and change your clothes. What's he doing? They're getting ready. They're getting cleaned up because of what? They're fixing to go meet with who? God. Jacob knows exactly what this means because he went away and he's come back to where? His father's house, and God's pointed him not to some random place, to where? To Bethel, where it all started. Okay? In verse 3, we must get up and go to Bethel. I will build an altar there to the God who answered me in my days of distress. He has been with me everywhere I've gone. Then they gave Jacob all their foreign gods and their earrings, and Jacob hid them under an oak near Shechem. And when they set out, a terror from God came over the cities around them, and they did not pursue Jacob's sons. Why would that have been? Remember the whole thing with Dinah? See, they're a small group. There's a whole bunch of them folks come on them and wiped them out. But God's what? God's told Jacob, go to Bethel. And what's taking place? God's put a terror on everybody around there to leave them alone. They got free passage through the land. Okay? But they're headed where? To fulfill that if-then statement. Okay? So Jacob and all who were with him came to Luz, that is Bethel, in the land of Canaan. Jacob built an altar there and called that place El Bethel, because it is there that God had revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. Honestly, I think this is the moment that Jacob gets saved. Saving knowledge right there. Because what? If you do this, then I will do that. And God says, okay, I've done my part. Guess what? It's time for you to go fulfill yours. You're going to go back to where? Bethel. And Jacob's not going, I wonder why. No, he knew exactly why. Time to get rid of the household idols. As for me and my house, we're going to what? Serve the Lord. Okay? I think this is Jacob's moment. They go, they build the altar, and this is Jacob's moment when he calls on the name of the Lord. And then verse 8 is kind of like almost a strange. We're here. We're right here. We're talking about God and him building the altar. And then it says Deborah, one who had nursed and raised Rebekah, died and was buried under the oak south of Bethel. So Jacob named it Elon, whatever. It's kind of like, what? Where'd that come from? And then it goes back to that whole event taking place. Now, I don't know why there's this little verse 8 that kind of jumps in there. But you can look at this verse 9 two different ways. One, it's the same night. They're having this ceremony. They're having the sacrifice, and they're calling on the name of the Lord. And then verse 9 takes place the same time, which I tend to believe. It says, God appeared to Jacob again after he returned from Pan-Aram and blessed him. For he said to him, your name is Jacob. Okay. You will no longer be named Jacob, but your name will be what? Israel. That's going back and what? Verifying that event that just happened here not long before this. When he had what? Wrestled with God all night. So he named him Israel. God also said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. God's now, look, there's been this moment, I think, of salvation. Jacob calls on the name of the Lord and says, this is the moment of my salvation and my family. And then God does what? God shows up, and now God's establishing the promise, officially establishing the promises to Jacob, or Israel now, that God had officially given to Abraham and officially gave to Isaac, but up until now has not officially given to Jacob. You know, it's kind of like that event when people lay hands on somebody. Okay, this is God coming and laying hands on him, giving him the promises, passing it down. I promised it to Abraham, your grandfather. I promised it to Isaac. And now, Jacob, I'm promising it to you. And he says, be fruitful and multiply. A nation, indeed an assembly of nations, will come from you, and kings will descend from you. I will give you the land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac. I will give the land to your future descendants. Then God withdrew from him at a place where he had spoken to him. Jacob set up a marker at the place where he had spoken to him, a stone marker. He poured a drink offering on it and anointed it with oil. Jacob named that place where God had spoken with him Bethel. See, I think here, what do you do with this? See, if you miss the point that God had all this planned out and God had all this worked out, okay, then you kind of make it hard when you get to the New Testament if you only go, well, Jesus is the Messiah, and you're just told that. But if you don't understand God actually didn't just pop him on the scene out of nowhere. God had this was instrumented by him, piece by piece by piece by piece, throughout history coming down. And he's not just random. It came through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, down to David. Okay? And this is going to be passed down. the other thing is, I think that if we have to be careful, we sometimes want to catch on to the super spiritual parts of things, and we miss the point of Jesus came as what? As a sacrifice, right? He came to die. And that all started from where? Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Okay? And this is portrayed on down throughout biblical history. What? Man's a sinner, and we can't do nothing about it. God had to do it in our place. Okay? Salvation is only because of what? The Lord. Okay? And so instead of looking sometimes at these extra super spiritual pieces of the puzzle, like at Jacob's dream, okay, you look at it and go, what took place? God revealed Himself to him. Gave him some knowledge, but Jacob doesn't get saved at that point. Jacob then does what? An if-then statement. If you do this, then I'll do that. And time goes on. Y'all been there? You know back here, but time goes on before you ever react on stuff. You get over here, and God then calls him back, and God's been with him the whole time, but God calls him back and says what? Hey, remember me? I'm the one that did all this. Remember your promise? And so God not only provided this way for him, and through him provides a way for all of us, but God provides the way, but then we also see what? The salvation moment of a hard-headed person. Us? Look, if Jacob can be saved, okay? He was a deceiver, a liar. I mean, you name it. And look, his kids weren't exactly the healthiest, most exemplary folks that there was in the Bible. Okay? Now from there, what do you get as you move forward? The story's going to jump over to Joseph for a while. And look, Joseph is not of any lineage of the Messiah. Is he a good picture of the Messiah? Is he Christ-like? Yeah. Is he a godly man? Yeah. But look, I'd make the argument, of all the brothers, he's the best one of them. And look, there's some stories y'all fixing to read about some of them folks, and there you're going to go, these are in the lineage of Christ. Okay? Which tells us also God can use all of us. Okay? But don't miss the fact throughout all of this, God, from the beginning of time, set in motion what? A plan for salvation. And we see as we look through these pieces, even today with this, God working it out. Okay? If then. Okay? If then. Now we be careful, don't try to make too many if then vows with God. Okay? But that's what we do with this. We need to look and remember. Scripture, there's one scarlet thread running all the way through, and it's a blood. Okay? The picture until it's revealed with what? The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He's going to go to a what? A cross. Spill His blood out. And then Hebrews tells us what? He's going to walk into the throne room, not on earth, into heaven, and put His blood on the altar. It's finished. Paid in full. And because of that blood, we get what? We have salvation. Okay? That's what we do with this. It gives us a stronger understanding of our own salvation as we look and see how God not only revealed it, how God put it into play. And it makes a difference in how we walk out our faith. Because look, if God can work with even a hard-headed sucker like Jacob and his 4 wives and his crazy kids, and still through that come out with a Messiah and still deliver us, it's pretty important. It's pretty powerful. Okay. Thanks.